Alright, so to continue the wet and wet technique, I gotta now start looking at the colors of the apple and a little bit more of the color of the ground where there's some texture. But I want to work on the apple first. So in order to do that, obviously, if I'm doing wet and wet, I've got to put clean water over the whole surface of the apple. And again, I'm using a square brush so that I can get a nice clean edge. Alright, so now that I have a damp surface there, I really have to start thinking about what's the lightest color that I can see in the apple. I already have a pale version of yellow, but I'm probably going to need a little bit more, and there's some green, and then I'm going to slowly build. So I'm going to put in a pale wash of yellow, but with a little bit more intensity. And I'm going to kind of mix that in. Just going to kind of hit that in there where it's brightest. And now I'm going to work into the yellow-green. So I pick up some green on my brush and kind of mix it in with the yellow here. So I can give myself a nice yellow-green. And I've got to continue to look at the contour. So I got this yellow-green. I got to pull a little more yellow in. I got to lift some of that off a little bit there, because I had too much water on the brush. So I'm just kind of lifting some of that out. Alright, so I've got the yellow-green in there. Let me get a little bit more just straight yellow. Again, the wet and wet is allowing me to get this nice, soft overall color. Now I just kind of have to let that dry a little bit before I come in with any of the red or any of the shaded areas of the apple, because those, if I put them in now with the whole surface wet, it's just going to spread all the way throughout, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to kind of keep my pale yellow-green in some of the other areas. Just want to punch it up just a little bit more, so and let that dry. Just blocking in areas of color. Now I just have to let that dry. Alright, so I've given it a little bit of time to dry, so it's not a wet surface. You can see there's still a little bit of shine over here, but right now it's a damp surface. And I can go in now, because you can see the softness of some of the reds and the oranges in through here. If I go in with a smaller brush and I wet that and I just pick up some red but with more pigment, and I want to grab some orange, so I'm going to use some orange in there. If I start in now and look at with a damp surface, look at what happens. You can see how it creates that nice soft edge. And it just kind of travels across the surface of the apple. Grab some more red orange here. And I can see still some of that green is showing through, which is what I want. And the intensity of the red that I'm picking up, obviously over areas here where it's more wet, if I keep going, it's just going to kind of filter out. Over here where it's a little bit more dry, you can see it's maintaining a little bit more. There's a little bit of a pale red, so I got to get a little bit more water over here. A little bit of a pale red color in the background here, almost like a thin glaze of color. And there's some strong red right along the back. And that surface area is almost totally dry. But you can see now that that area is drying a little bit more. That just creates a nice soft edge where the fading of the color change can happen with the wet on damp surface. Now, I'm still not done. Obviously I need to go back and touch areas up, especially some of the darks, but you always want to build light to dark. A little bit more of that glazed red, that pale glazed red right in here I can see. And you can see the brush stroke, I'm trying to follow the direction and the contour of the apple. Now I'm going to let that dry some more. Alright, now that my apple is almost totally dry, it's still a little damp, which is good because I don't want to get a lot of hard edges in there. Now I got to start putting in some of the detailing, and that's going to be that's going to happen on a dry surface or a damp surface. So I've got some of these darks where I have the front edge. I'm just going to use a little bit of brown and the red, and right in that small area, maybe a little bit of blue. It's always good to mix to try to get a black, almost like a prismatic black. Instead of using black, you can see that little bit of blue and brown and red gives me a nice medium tone. So right along that edge right in here, I want to get a nice clean. Alright, that gives me that front edge. And you can see the edge of it is still pretty soft. So I just clean my brush and I just want to soften that just a little bit more because it was pretty harsh. That dark works okay right there. Now I want to get some of that stem color. The stem color is a little bit darker on the left side, so if I grab a little bit of blue and brown, makes it a little bit darker there. And then I can get some green, because there's a little bit of a yellow green in there. On this side of it, you can see the wet and wet really allows it to kind of create the blending that it needs in that area. And now I've got some other reds. Clean that green out of my brush. I got some other reds that I want to work out, and some reddish greens, so I could use the complement to shade back here where I've got some of that stronger red. And again, it's a damp surface, so that it's gonna blend itself out really well. And now here, just come right back in with that shade of red, and my surface is still damp, so I can create those darker tones of red. And I'm going to show you how I can kind of filter that down and have it get a little bit more transparent as I work my way across. So I'm just going to use a little shade complement here with some red and green. So if I put those blocking areas of darker red in there, more intense, alright, that kind of comes over that edge, so I can put some of those darker reds in there like that. So now, to soften that edge, I'm just going to use clean water on my brush, and I'm just going to kind of pull those edges out a little bit. Some of the edges are sharp, so I'm not going to mess with them too much, but I'm just going to kind of soften and pull some of those tight edges like that, and pull them down, pull them down, pull them down. Just kind of soften that there. Do the same thing over here. So the surface is still damp, so it allows that flow of the brush to kind of pull the color, like you did on the test, to pull color away from a certain area so it doesn't have that sharp line. And it's still a textural process. Got some pale brown over here. It's a glazing. Alright, the reflection on this side over here. Make it a little more water in there. A little bit of that right here. So I'm kind of muting that really strong, bright green. Now, since the ground is dry, I've got that shadow that I want to put in. So I'm just going to keep this mixture of the blue and brown. And put in that sharper area of cast shadow. That's that little bit of darkness below. Now I can see that the cast shadow transitions all the way across. Now to do that, I'm going to need to wet that area with the big brush. Alright, so I can see that it goes diagonal across there. And right around, there's those two bumps right here and right there. Alright, so I just put clean water in there. Now I'm going to mix up a bit more of that blue and brown, what I like to kind of call watercolor black. Gives me a nice soft gray. So now when I put that in, right along that water edge, and I hit it up against there, and I come down along that edge right there. And just kind of soften and filter it right into that. And I got a little bit of a shadow here on the apple, so I can just kind of put a little bit of that gray in there. Its surface is still damp, but you notice it's just a super pale wash of that gray color, that watercolor black. So I'm just using this as my last little touch up to create some of the darks that are visible on the apple. And now while I have that, I could kind of put in some of the grain, the wood texture. Instead of leaving it that singular flat color, I can just kind of come back into that wash, and I'm going to kind of wet the background surface. Just kind of hit it with a little bit of texture. Not going to overdo it. Get right up against the edge there, just to kind of vary the lightness and darkness of the background. Got a little bit dark on this side, so I can just kind of lift out some of that. Right back to that light brown. And I can use the brush and just come along and kind of lift some of that texture off the cast shadow. Alright, so it's all the techniques that we went over. Leave that light back there. That just gives my overall surface a much more accurate wet and wet, soft watercolor look.